apologizing for the technology chaos. The only thing I can tell you is it's less important than when Elon Musk had somebody throw a rock at his new truck. I'm Geoff Lipman. I'm the co-creator of SUNx, which is the Strong Universal Network, which is a legacy program for Maurice Strong, who for 40 years was the architect of what is today's global sustainable development system. From the first Stockholm Earth Conference in 1972, right through the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, which Maurice Strong was the Secretary General and Chairman of, he put in place the institutional framework which has led to today's UNFCCC and today's IPCC, which are the international mechanisms which are being used to respond to the climate crisis. And SUNx is a program developed with Maurice Strong and as a legacy for Maurice Strong, who I worked with for 25 years, latterly with him in China. So I'm a professor, I'm a climate activist, even if an old one, and I'm a former executive director in IATA, founding president of WTTC, and assistant secretary general in UNWTO. What I want to discuss today is our work with Exo Travel Foundation to help the world respond to the climate crisis through climate-friendly travel. And let me say from the outset, we consider this relationship with Exo Travel Foundation to be one of the most important things we've done to move from a global conceptual framework to real practical work in the travel and tourism marketplace. The climate crisis has rocketed to the top of the global agenda. It's been propelled by science, by growing international consensus, with the important exception of Donald Trump and the United States, and wonderful young activists led by Greta Thunberg. I want to talk about three issues today. Climate change itself, what we are doing generally in SUNx to respond, highlighting the findings of our first annual report, which was published with WTTC in September in the sidelines of the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Summit, and which is designed to accelerate global climate response across the travel and tourism sector. And last but not least, I want to talk about our plans with Exo Travel and how each and every one of you can and hopefully will become actively engaged with us in what is a 30-year transformation agenda. Here you can see climate change is existential. That's the most important message I can leave with you today. It's a message that Maurice Strong was giving over 30 years ago. If we don't fix it, there is a good chance that humanity as we know it will not survive. It's as simple as that. The polar ice caps are melting. It's disruptive, it's volatile. It's causing people to flee their homes. It's producing massive storm surges. And it's permanent. It's not going to change for the better. If it changes, it's going to change for the worse until we, as a global community, can regain control of our future. The impact is particularly strong in destinations. It changes lifestyles. It changes our travel and tourism products completely. Who wants to visit Dominica or the Bahamas after there have been hurricanes which take the essence of society away? It affects visitor flows and the economics that go with them. And it changes community well-being. And it's most focused in Asia. Asia has the fastest growth, the most people, the most exposed coasts, the most island states, and you know well, it has dreadful hurricanes and unpredictable forest fires of the kind that we're seeing in Australia, in Indonesia, and which are getting worse and more uncontrollable. This chart shows the consequences of inaction in transforming to the new climate economy. Less for my generation than for yours, and even more importantly for our kids and grandkids. The red on this chart shows the range of business as usual to moderate change in behavior. And you can see from that chart that our grandkids are right in the middle of that. The blue shows what we have to do. We have no options. This is a war, and we have to behave as if we're in a war. And we have to start this action now. We can't afford further delay. This is why we have developed in SUNx Malta what we call a plan for our kids. It's to help the sector respond positively to this ultimate challenge. It's because we sincerely believe that if we act now, we can deal with this issue just as our industry has dealt with other seemingly impossible issues over the past 50 years. Whether it's the hijacking of aircraft, whether it's the incredible increase in fuel prices that we had in the 1980s when OPEC was at its most active, or whether it's the economic meltdown we had of the last 10 years. We reorganized and found ways to deal with it, and that's what we're proposing we will do with this issue. There are 4 potential action paths that we can take. The first 2 of them, business as usual, and Paris 2.0, which was what was agreed as the goal for 2050 when the Paris Climate Agreement was first made. They're not enough. These are yesterday's story. What we now have to look at is a Paris 1.5 scenario. We cannot afford to allow the planet to heat more than 1.5 degrees Celsius against historical models by 2050. And to do that, our society has to become climate neutral by 2050. Let me just identify what the UN means by climate neutral, because there are many expressions around the future new economy. Some talk about carbon neutral, some talk about carbon zero, some talk about climate zero. The United Nations has developed a concept of climate neutral. First of all, it means that all greenhouse gas has to be covered, not just carbon. There are some greenhouse gases like methane, which is significantly more destructive than carbon. So the UN system says we have to control all greenhouse gases. And we have to peak our emissions now. In the next 2 or 3 years, we have to put a cap on where emissions are going. We have to reduce those emissions by 50% by 2030. That's a 10-year time frame we have. This does not have to all happen tomorrow. We have to think of this rather like the story of the snail walking up a tree and he meets a woodpecker. And the woodpecker says, "Where are you going, snail?" And the snail says, "I'm going to eat the green leaves up there." And the woodpecker looks up and says, "I don't see any green leaves." And the snail says, "They'll be there by the time I get there." We have to think this way. We have to think long term. And we have to think of being zero carbon by 2050. And the last element of this, and it's very important, particularly because of new initiatives by companies like Travel, where we can't eliminate the carbon and the greenhouse gases, we have to find ways to offset the impacts. We have to find ways to pay for our pollution by supporting other initiatives such as tree planting or efforts to save the coral reefs. We have to do this in such a way that our pollution is counterbalanced. The first step, we believe, is to embrace a conceptual framework that the UNFCCC has set for the world inside the travel and tourism community. And that's why we produced our first climate-friendly travel report, a kind of status of where the industry is today. And the message of that report is very clear. It says we are not effectively engaged, we are not ambitious enough, we are not going fast enough, we must step up our game. It points out that one of the biggest challenges is with transport, shipping, and particularly with aviation. And it stresses we must start now. Starting now is the key. And that's why we've developed our SUNx Malta carbon climate-friendly travel strategy. If you look on the right hand of this slide, you will see the pictogram of the Sustainable Development Goals. a 2030 delivery of the future of everything in our world. 17 goals, 169 targets, 200 plus indicators, and groups everywhere, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of groups arguing that one or another of these goals is the most important goal for society. Our view is that we will focus on the existential issue. We will try to help the travel and tourism community in a strategic way over 30 years, make itself climate neutral by 2050 with a 1.5 degree trajectory. And these are the elements that we're putting together to make this happen. Firstly, a registry of company and community ambition plans, an annual sector status report, and a think tank of global experts to review every year the status and to report on where we need to go to keep on track. In a way, it's our own version of the IPCC. The second component is a learning system. How do we get this concept out to the international community? How do we get it out to 200 countries around the world, all of whom have their own ambition paths, and all of whom are looking at travel and tourism as a vital part of their economic development? And the next component is a concept that we've created to put 100,000 young activists, and as I say this, I'm thinking of all of the people listening to this webinar, 100,000 young activists across all UN states by 2030, over the next decade, to help companies and communities transform. We need our own Greta Thunbergs. And last but not least, our SDG 17 partnership program to create this global outreach. That's the framework that we are putting in place to respond to the existential issue. Let me just add a very important and fundamental piece that came out of this report. What is our central pillar of climate-friendly travel? First of all, it has to be measured. We're very good at measuring what I'll call the economic impacts of travel and tourism. And I've been involved for over 25 years, certainly in the initial work we did in WTTC in the 1990s and in UNWTO after that, in putting together a system known as satellite accounting, which plucks travel and tourism out of national accounts and allows us to see what this complicated cross-sectoral industry is producing in terms of GDP, in terms of jobs, in terms of trade. We've been measuring this now since for 20 years, and we're getting pretty good at it. And with WTTC, who developed a complex simulation model, you can look at any country and you can see the projections of their positive impacts. We've used it, and everybody is using those numbers now. 10% of GDP, jobs and trade, 5% direct, 5% indirect. When we started, nobody was using those numbers. People were challenging them. Today, they're part of the accepted statistical database of our sector, and the rest of the world is using those numbers. But on the other side of the balance sheet are impacts on the environment, and particularly our impacts in terms of carbon outputs and greenhouse gas outputs are not measured, or at least they're not measured in the same system. There's another group of people, environmental scientists, who are measuring those impacts. Critics of the industry are measuring those impacts. And they're using them in isolation. And what's important is this measurement system has to become holistic. We have to measure these two things together, and we have to balance the good things and the bad things, and we have to get rid of the bad things when it comes to the climate, because if we don't, I remind you, our grandkids will not survive. So it's more important to fix those issues than it is to fix our growth targets. There has to be a uniform balance sheet. The second thing is we have to be green if we want to grow. And when I say green, it can be ecotourism, it can be responsible travel, it can be impact travel, it can be pro-poor tourism, and there are 1,000 different names for what is environmentally responsible growth. It has to be low carbon, it has to be socially inclusive, it has to fit in with a pattern where society benefits, not just a small group of people. It has to look to nature-based solutions, because it's clear, increasingly clear, that nature keeps itself in balance much better than humanity does. And it has to deal with the circular economy so that we control waste and excesses. And in a travel and tourism context, to be green, it has to have a destination management program which benefits the destination and which produces a kind of visitor economy that each and every destination agrees it wants. That's tens of hundreds of thousands and millions of destinations around the world have to decide if they want to have small numbers of tourists, large numbers of tourists, and if they do it badly, over tourism. All of this is part of a concept of green. And last but not least, everything has to be 2050 proof if we want to make the change that we know needs to be made. We have to have an ultimate focus on a climate neutral 2050 1.5 degree scenario. We have to use technology to do this, and we as humans have to keep control of that technology so that we can fit it into this climate-friendly travel framework. And this is the only future for companies, for communities, for customers, and for our colleagues who we work with. So let me talk now about how we will change and how we will work with Exo Travel and other smart companies to make this new world that we believe is essential. Well, we will do it carefully, the way that hedgehogs make love. We will learn, we will scale, we will engage, we will communicate, and we will connect. Let me quickly take you through each of these. We've developed, and I say we, I'm talking now about an expanding concept from a SUNx base. We see SUNx as a kind of irritant in the system. I've described it elsewhere, like if you want to produce a pearl, you need a piece of sand in the oyster to make it happen. And we intend to be that sand in the oyster. We've collaborated with a group in Geneva called the Earth Focus Foundation so that we can develop some learning programs for kids. And they're very ingenious people. They have a series of 65 animated cartoons for kids featuring a dodo, which was made extinct by humans in Mauritius. And the dodo returns to Earth and becomes a symbol of how kids need to adapt. And this is really important because kids have lessons now in school which they never had when I was growing up. They have an Earth Day, they have celebrations, they have programs which include environmental well-being. And these people, our friends in Geneva, have developed something called a sustainer bus. They've taken a bus, an electric bus, they've made it a learning place, a classroom, and it goes from school to school, educating people about the climate crisis. We've factored travel and tourism into this important work. And you see at the bottom last 2 weeks ago, we engaged with Les Roches, one of the world's best travel and tourism training schools, in a festival which brought the community together and included the work that we do with kids and the work that we plan to do with graduates. Here you see a picture of the portal that we've created, an online resource base for research, for multimedia education, and for feeds from some of the incredible organizations that are collecting vital data on climate resilience mechanisms. And we intend to promote this database globally, working with companies and with academic institutions in the travel and tourism world. So learning is a very important part of our activity. Secondly, we want to scale. Whatever we're doing now, we want this to fit with the international community's evolution to 2050. This is the legacy of Maurice Strong, who started this initiative back in 1972. And recently, I was listening to some students talking about how they see change happening. And they talked about nudging. And this is stuck in my mind. Nudging means you know where you want to go. It's very difficult to get people to move. You can't make moves in huge steps. You have to do things in small nudges. So, for example, if you look at this chart in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was put together, the concept was we can't increase our temperatures by 2 degrees, and ideally it should be less. By 2020, when the COP meets in Madrid in a week's time, and I'll be there with WTTC, 2 degrees is passé. it's 1.5 degrees. Over 5 years, international thinking has been nudged to a new level. And this is how we envisage working with the Exo Travel Foundation and SUNx Malta. We will help the travel and tourism industry move to scale. The third thing we have to do is to engage. And this is very important. This is one of the most important messages I can give you. We have to engage at the national level. We have to do what people call global activity. You take a global concept and you reduce it to the national level. Why is that? Because lifestyles are determined at the national level. Indonesia has a contribution to the international framework which is developed as a national context for Indonesia. It's called a nationally determined contribution. The Kingdom of Cambodia has another one. Every country is filing these framework initiatives with the UNFCCC. And of course, to have a national approach, you have to collect all of the local approaches. So as we move forward, we have to think in terms of fitting into our national approach. And that's the same if you're in Cambodia, or if you're in Bali, or if you're in Europe. The same approach is going to apply. And then we have to communicate. And this is where, working with the Exo Travel Foundation, we see we can bring our international conceptual changes down through you to the local level, and we can get that message across with all of the skill sets that an organization like Exo Travel Foundation, which is communicating to the marketplace, can do. And we're very appreciative. For example, you see here two of the graphics which have been developed by the foundation and which are much better than we could ever think of producing ourselves. That's the value of working together. And this is not a static activity. This is something where we have to stay connected locally, internally, using your material and using our material. And last but not least, we have to do this using our SDG 17 partnerships, which we have signed with Exo Travel Foundation, which we consider to be incredibly important, and which we believe is where we can create a much better, a much more hopeful, a much more positive future for everybody. Again, my apologies for the technical screw up at the beginning. Many thanks for your attention, and I think we're ready to take some questions and answers now. And I think there's a mechanism for you to put questions forward. I can see them on my screen, and I'll do my best to try to respond.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. This is Ollie Wheatcroft, Programme Manager at the SUNx Malta Foundation. I'd just like to start the process off whilst we're waiting for the questions to come through, and ask you one question, which is how you feel this massive transition that the world's largest industry needs to make to achieve its 2050 goals How much of that do you feel is going to be achieved through regulation or incentives or pure economics in terms of efficiency changes and really where the onus lies with government, private sector or individuals?
Well, the answer, as I would look at it, is we're going to need all of those. We always need government leadership. That's how our society has been set up. And we have government leadership in the Paris Accords and in the nationally determined contributions. The problem that we have with this is that we have a climate terrorist in Donald Trump, who's taken the world's most powerful country out of the Accords and who's responsible for 25% of the global economy and for some of the largest, most powerful drivers of pollution in the fossil fuel industries. And we need to bring this back into the system, and hopefully that will occur when Donald Trump is no longer in office, which hopefully will be sooner rather than later. In the meantime, you will find that even in the United States, there are nearly 4,000 companies and communities who have agreed that they will stay in the Paris system. So we have an overriding global system. I think what we don't have is the application of that in every country around the world. I think that will come during the next 5 years. The response by industry needs to be substantial. We need to move beyond the activities of the climate deniers who are holding back the change to this response. A lot of this in cleverly disguised activities funded by some of the richest people in the world who are driving fossil fuel and coal activity. And we need to be, in every jurisdiction, we will have a different level of regulation in every country, of regulation and incentive. And we will need both. In China, we have the socialist market economy, where the balance is very different from the kind of regulatory system that you find in Western Europe or the United States. But if we have a common goal of where we want to be in 2050, all of these systems will, as the evidence becomes clearer, as the weather gets worse, as the impacts on our economy and our lifestyles gets deeper, we will find, as we are finding already, response to climate change becomes deeper and deeper. And I think if we bear that in mind, like the snail walking up the tree, and we keep our travel and tourism discipline, we work to bring our sector into a climate-friendly travel framework. And this is a long answer to a shortish question, but I would say there's one other critical thing that I will mention now. We have to fix the aviation problem. Of all of the activities in travel and tourism, hospitality, travel services, all of the ground activity, and in much of the local transport, there will be alternatives to fossil fuel. There will be electric cars, electric scooters, so important across Asia. There will be superfast electrified trains and buses. And the biggest challenge is at the moment, there is no widely available aviation fuel which does not pollute. And I believe if there's one single issue that has to be resolved, it's a global combined activity of government and industry to create a widespread availability of synthetic aviation fuel. The airlines are telling us that they can reduce their carbon footprint more or less by 50% by 2050. Well, that's not enough because we need aviation. Aviation is growing. For countries which are small island states or landlocked, there aren't any alternatives for their economic development. So we need what I call a moonshot, and governments and the fossil fuel companies and the travel and tourism companies all have to fund and work together to find a synthetic aviation fuel. And I do not believe that is a challenge as big as going to the moon, or as Elon Musk, who also should be part of this, believes going to Mars produces. I'm trying to see some other questions here.
We have one here which is from a lady who's a travel agent in the UK, which is really about the onus on the consumer and how they can make a difference. So this is from Liz Penn, based in the UK. Hi there. As a travel agent based in the UK, what would your recommendations be for clients wanting to visit Asia? Would it be longer trips, carbon offsetting, or insetting locally?
Well, thank you, Liz. My answer is very simply that consumers have to make their own choices. There's nothing wrong with offsetting. Another question that I saw asked if offsetting is good or bad. Offsetting is not a perfect solution because you're paying somebody else to do something good so that you can continue to pollute. But if you don't have an alternative, it's better than doing nothing. It's going to produce new initiatives which will help somewhere. Whether you do that locally or in the countries you visit is basically, I think, between you and consumers and their own conscience. Some people will want to spend the money in the place where they live, and other people will want to spend it in the place that they visit. The only tipping balance on the scales may be, you know that in many of the places that you visit, your income creation, your job creation is more vital to the development of those communities, and in some cases to the survival of those countries in a new climate economy, if they have the chance to make changes where they are. So maybe for many people, the rationale is, as I travel, I'm impacting on that local population. Let me impact in a positive way. But at the end of the day, like so many of these consumer choices, lifestyle choices, you have to look in the mirror and say, what kind of a person am I? I do not believe that there can be a regulatory or even a corporate dictate on this. You can have incentives, tax incentives, tax penalties to stop bad behavior, tax incentives to make it more desirable to operate one way or another as a company or even as a consumer. But it's a very imperfect mechanism. The United Kingdom's had a green tax since 1990. None of it has gone to travel and tourism. It's all gone into the general treasury. So it's very hard to say there's any right way to do things. What's important is that you do something some way. And I think the changes will come slowly at first. And as we get closer and closer to tipping points and people begin to see the terrible, terrible consequences of extreme climate change, people will react more radically, whether it's at the government level If you're in a war, you ration. You operate differently than if you're in a peacetime situation. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, we're in a war.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I've got another question here from Daniel de Gruyter. He asks, thank you. You're talking about DMC implementations at the destination. As an outbound operator in Europe, how can we contribute to the support of these projects and help reach the goals? What would core objectives be for us as outbound agents in order to, he says, preach to our clients, but it's really about, I think, conveying the message and the importance of the issue to them.
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 or 3 fundamental points that you as an outbound operator buy into the concept that climate change is existential and the most important issue on the international agenda and on every one of us on the planet's agenda, that travel and tourism is a good thing if it can fit into the global response system, which is being developed by the UNFCCC and the international community, that climate-friendly travel, as we are trying to define it together, is the right way to go because it's a response mechanism which tries to do the right thing in terms of climate change, and that you look for products and for destinations which fit into this pattern, and you offer them as strongly as is economically feasible to your clients. And this is a long-term strategy. You try to ensure that all of the products that you're offering fit into this concept of climate-friendly travel, that they're measured, that they're green, and that they're 2050 proof. We've tried to reduce this to the simplest possible conceptual framework.
Thank you, Geoffrey. One more question here from an Anna Barrett in the south of France. She asks whether travel and tourism can also be involved in actually actively pushing for national climate emergency policies within their destinations, and should they also be participating in disaster risk mitigation and adaptation strategies?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that question is definitively yes and yes. Like any sector, travel and tourism is heavily involved in national socio-economic development. And if we believe that the climate crisis has to be responded to by our sector, then we would want to get involved in that development at a national level. And I personally believe that travel and tourism organizations should be taking a strong, active role in these issues. And that's what we're trying to encourage through our SDG 17 partnership initiatives.
Thank you. If there are any more questions, now's the time to answer them. Otherwise, we will wrap this up. Just looking here. Okay, one more question that's just come through. Hi, this is from Mujde in Morocco, who is, I know Mujde is part of our network, who is collaborating with us on our Climate Champions program. She is a professor who is teaching at the University of Rabat in Morocco. I'd like to ask you, what do you think about the perception of local people in tourism destinations in terms of acting in a more eco-friendly way. Sorry, I'm just trying to expand this here so I can read it more properly. The tourism industry is very connected with hospitality. That means tourism starts at home. And we should have our own Greta Thunbergs, firstly, within our own homes. Therefore, should Green to Grow, the steps, start with eco-friendly perception of local people? If so, is there any attempt for local people's perceptions? And sorry if I haven't read that very clearly. It's just
no, but I think I understand the question. And let me say, I want to give an example of a major study that I was involved in Bali, in Indonesia, which is very germane to exo travel and the work that we're doing. This was a 2-year study. It was funded by the Minister of Tourism of Indonesia, and it was conducted through the University of Victoria in Melbourne, Australia. And we, in this work, we not only did surveys of visitors, we did surveys of local populations. And we discovered very clearly that the position of the local population must be the starting point and the finishing point for a good tourism product. At the end of the day, tourists arrive and they leave. And the local population are the ones who are left with the good and the bad things that they produce. So our study in Indonesia discovered that despite all of the growth from Australian tourists, the local people weren't so happy to have the lifestyle that was being imported from Australia. They didn't want the drinking, they didn't want what they considered to be corruption of their own young people. They didn't like the Chinese arriving in large bus loads down narrow lanes, which had historically been places where they'd placed their temples for worship. And so in devising a strategy for Indonesia, we actually, instead of doing a typical PowerPoint diagram, we created the strategy in the form of an Indonesian temple. And the foundations were something called Tri Hita Karana. I'll never forget those words. It's Balinese for the link between spirituality, God, if you like, if you believe in God, nature, the earth, and humanity. And they wanted their tourism to be built on that foundation. And I've been convinced ever since that local people's concerns and local issues have to be built into this program, which is why we're so keen on our program for the kids and the idea, for example, of having buses which go to local communities and allow a discussion, a kind of town hall grassroots discussion about how this concept of climate-friendly travel can be brought into the mindset of the local community. I hope that was sufficiently professorial.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Well, if there aren't any more questions, then I would like to thank you very much for this first presentation in conjunction with EXO Foundation, who we're very proud to be partnering with, and like to thank you and to wrap this up.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for being an attentive audience, and again, apologies for the Elon Musk beginning.
Thank you, Geoffrey.